One billionaire drove home that night with nothing in his heart but silence. But it was the dog, just 1 month old, just lost his mother, who heard something no one else could. A soft cry beneath the snow. A soul forgotten. While the world kept moving, Max stopped, barked, insisted. And when Dorian followed him into the cold, he didn't find a threat. He found a 70-year-old woman collapsed by the road, alone, confused, and invisible to the world. What came next was not rescue. It was reunion, redemption, and the quiet beginnings of love. This is the story of a tiny pup, a guarded man, and a stranger who turned out to be family. Before we begin, hit like, subscribe, and tap the bell, because some stories find you when you least expect them. Boulder, Colorado. Late January. The snow had been falling relentlessly since early morning. Thick, slow flakes drifted from a sky the color of steel, settling into silent layers over pine trees, rooftops, and winding mountain roads. The air was bitter, the wind sharp with the scent of frost and cedar. In the distance, the city of Boulder rested beneath a white shroud, its twinkling lights muffled beneath heavy clouds and silence. Dorian Hale sat behind the wheel of his charcoal gray Range Rover, heading north through a forested pass just outside the city. At 38, Dorian was the sort of man who could walk into a room and freeze the air with a glance. Tall and lean, he wore his tailored overcoat like armor, his salt and pepper hair always immaculately trimmed, and his steel gray eyes spoke of a man who had built empires with little more than willpower and distrust. A self-made billionaire, Dorian kept people at a distance with practiced precision. Grief, too, had shaped him. Losing his mother at 12 to a slow illness had carved something cold and permanent into his soul. Nestled on the passenger seat beside him, wrapped in a wool blanket, was Max. Max was a golden retriever puppy, only 1 month old. He was small for his age, the last survivor of a litter, struck by a sudden virus. His fur was fluffy and light gold, his ears too big for his round face, and his wide dark eyes still held that innocent softness found only in very young creatures. Dorian had not meant to adopt a dog, especially not one this young, but when he'd seen Max curled alone in the corner of the breeder's shelter, something inside him, long quiet, had stirred. They had been driving home from Denver, where Dorian had spent the afternoon in back-to-back meetings. It was nearly 7 p.m., and darkness had already settled over the highway. The heater hummed softly, snow flicked against the windshield in streaks, and Dorian was focused on getting home before the weather worsened. Until Max barked. It wasn't loud, just a single sharp yip that made Dorian glance sideways. Max had sat up, ears perked, his tiny head swiveling toward the window. "What is it?" Dorian asked, brow furrowing. Max barked again, twice this time, and scrambled clumsily onto the console. His tiny paws slipped on the smooth surface, but he pressed his nose to the passenger side window, whining with insistence. Dorian's grip tightened on the wheel. He scanned the snowy roadside. Nothing. Another bark, high-pitched, urgent. Against his usual instincts, Dorian slowed the car. Max was never this agitated. The puppy was usually quiet, especially on drives. Dorian pulled over beside a snowbank, the tires crunching over the ice. The road was empty, the forest dense and hushed on either side. Max yelped again, scrambling toward the driver's door now. Dorian sighed. "You better not be doing this because you want to chase a squirrel." He wrapped Max back in the blanket and stepped out into the cold. The wind sliced through his coat like knives. As soon as he set Max down, the puppy wriggled free and bolted toward the tree line. Max, Dorian called, alarm rising. "Hey!" But Max didn't stop. He darted through the snow, leaving a trail of tiny paw prints. Dorian cursed under his breath and followed boots crunching through the white. The forest was dim, the trees crowding in, but there through the veil of snow, he saw Max barking beside a heap of something. Clothes, trash, no. It moved. Dorian hurried forward. The shape became clearer, a hunched figure curled into itself. A woman, old, frail, half buried in snow. She wore a thin wool coat and house slippers. Her white hair was matted with ice, and her hands were red and stiff from the cold. Her eyes blinked slowly, lips blue with cold. She murmured something, but the sound was lost in the wind. Ma'am. Dorian knelt beside her, his voice steady, despite the chill in his blood. "Can you hear me?" She didn't answer, only looked past him with a vacant stare. Max whined and pressed his body against her, trying to offer warmth. Dorian's mind kicked into gear. She wouldn't survive much longer out here. He shrugged off his overcoat and wrapped it around her shoulders. She was frighteningly light, her body limp like a forgotten doll. "I've got you," he whispered. Lifting her gently, he trudged back toward the car. Max stayed close to his heels, glancing back as if to make sure she was safe. Back at the vehicle, Dorian laid her across the reclined passenger seat, turning up the heat. He retrieved an emergency blanket from the back and tucked it around her. Max climbed up beside her and nestled at her hip, tiny tail thumping, once, then still. Dorian stared at them both, this stranger pale and shivering, and Max looking up at him with quiet purpose. He took out his phone and dialed emergency services. "I need an ambulance," he said. "Female, 70s, found unconscious on Forest Loop Road just outside Boulder." "Yes." "Yes, she's breathing but barely." As he hung up, he sat back, chest rising and falling with a strange tightness. He didn't know this woman's name. He didn't know how she'd ended up here alone in the storm. But he knew this. If not for Max, she would have died tonight. He reached down, scratching gently behind Max's ear. "Good boy." Max licked his fingers in reply. Outside, the snow kept falling. The road back to Dorian's secluded estate cut through the woods like a dark ribbon laid across a white canvas. Snow continued to fall in whispering flurries, and the air outside was sharp enough to bite through wool. Inside the SUV, the heater hummed, fighting off the cold clinging to the windows. The old woman, still unnamed, lay reclined in the passenger seat, bundled in 2 blankets and Dorian's thick overcoat. Her breathing was shallow but steady now, and Max had curled up at her side like a silent sentinel. Dorian glanced at her again as he turned onto the final stretch of road. Her hair, long and silver, framed a face that might have once been striking, now softened and faded by age. Wrinkles etched the corners of her closed eyes, her lips slightly parted in restless sleep. Whatever had brought her into that snowstorm was lost in the fog of her mind, but it lingered in the faint tension still visible in her brow. He didn't know why he hadn't waited for the ambulance. The dispatcher had promised it would arrive within 15 minutes, but Dorian had felt an urgency he couldn't explain. She had already been out in the storm for who knew how long. He couldn't shake the feeling that time was fragile. The gates of his property creaked open, triggered by the silent code from his dashboard. The mansion loomed ahead, a stone and timber structure nestled into the hillside, modern yet warm, built with the intention of comfort, but long deprived of it. Most of the rooms were dark, the security lights casting pale glows across snow-dusted glass panes. Dorian parked in the side garage, wrapped the woman tighter in the blankets, and carried her into the house, with Max trotting anxiously behind. The warmth of the interior hit like a wave. Radiant heat pulsed from the floorboards, and the scent of pine logs lingered from a fire burned earlier that morning. Dorian set her down gently on the tufted chaise in the den and knelt beside her, checking her pulse again. "Still with us," he murmured. "Barely." Max stood on his hind legs, placing his paws gently on the edge of the chaise. Dorian glanced at him. "Watch her." He returned moments later with a first aid kit, a warm towel, and a fresh bottle of water. As he dabbed gently at the woman's temples and coaxed her lips open for sips, a low moan escaped her throat. "Ma'am," he said softly, "can you tell me your name?" Her eyes opened slowly, pale blue, clouded, uncertain. "Do you know where you are?" She blinked at the ceiling, then at him. Her lips formed a soundless shape. Her gaze drifted to Max, who now rested against her leg. "Warm," she whispered finally. Dorian exhaled. "Yes, you're safe now." The rest of the night passed in slow, careful rhythms. Dorian moved her upstairs to the guest room, the only one besides his own that had been kept ready. The bed was soft, the sheets clean, and the walls held a few of Sarah's old paintings, soft strokes of lavender fields and gentle skies. Sarah had painted them before she died, when color was her protest against fading life. Max refused to leave the woman's side. When Dorian tried to coax him out, he simply circled once, laid beside her with a huff, and placed his chin over her thigh. Dorian allowed it. He turned off the main lights and let the room fall into dim amber from a lamp near the bed. She had already slipped back into sleep breath, deeper now, her hands slightly curled over the blanket. In the hallway, Dorian paused, leaning against the wall. The house was too quiet again. But this time, something was different. There was presence. Life. The next morning arrived with soft winter light, peeking through frosted windows. Dorian brewed strong coffee and stood barefoot on the heated kitchen tiles. Max patted and tail-wagging slowly. He stretched, yawned, then sat at Dorian's feet with an expectant look. "You stayed the whole night," Dorian murmured, crouching. "She must have made quite an impression." Max wagged his tail and gave a low, affirmative woof. Dorian ruffled his ears. "Let's go check on her." They climbed the staircase quietly. The guest room door was half open. Inside, the woman sat propped up in bed, dressed in one of Sarah's old knit sweaters, her frail shoulders nearly lost in the folds. She looked around with timid curiosity. Her eyes landed on Dorian. "This isn't my room." "No," he said gently. "You were found last night in the snow. You don't remember." She frowned, then shook her head slowly. "No, only trees, cold, and a dog." Dorian gestured to Max, who patted in happily. Her face softened. "Yes, him. We don't know your name yet." Dorian continued, stepping closer. "Do you remember anything else? Anything at all?" The woman looked down at her lap. Her fingers were trembling. "I don't know. I don't think so. Do you want me to call someone? I don't know who to call." Dorian nodded. "Then we'll figure it out. No rush." She looked at him, then really looked this tall man with a quiet voice and tired eyes. "Thank you," she said. Dorian offered a tight smile. "You're welcome." Later that morning, while preparing the guest room more comfortably, Max began pawing at something near the base of the armchair. Dorian knelt beside him and uncovered a small bundle that had been tucked into the lining of the old coat the woman wore. Inside was a folded, time-worn piece of paper. On it was a faded name, June, 2009. Alongside it, a crinkled photo of a young woman with kind eyes and sunburnished skin smiling in front of a garden full of lavender. Dorian stared at it for a long moment. Max nudged his hand with his nose. "Well," Dorian said, voice low, "looks like we might have a place to start." He placed the items in a small box and tucked it into the drawer beside the guest bed. Max, satisfied, circled and flopped onto the rug with a sigh. That night, Dorian checked on the woman one last time before bed. She was already asleep, Max curled beside her. The box remained untouched on the nightstand, a quiet reminder that some stories are not lost, just waiting to be remembered. The snow had stopped by morning, leaving behind a soft, sparkling crust across the hills. Boulder's sky stretched clear and blue above the mountains, but the cold lingered sharp in the wind and the echo of breath. Inside the mansion, warmth hummed quietly through the walls, and in the guest bedroom, sunlight streamed across the bed where the old woman still slept, her breathing steady, her fingers slightly curled into the wool blanket. Dorian stood at the kitchen island phone, pressed to his ear. His other hand moved absent-mindedly over Max's head. The puppy sat loyally at his feet, tail curled around his body, ears flicking at the distant hum of the espresso machine. "Yes," Dorian said, his voice firm but calm. "Found her yesterday evening. No ID, no bag, no emergency tag. About 70 white hair, 5'3", maybe 100 pounds. Fair skin, pale blue eyes. Dressed in a thin coat, no gloves, no memory of her name." On the other end, a nurse from Boulder General Hospital responded with kind professionalism. Her name was Linda, mid-40s with a warm, gravelly voice that sounded like someone who'd worked long nights and still greeted people with a smile. "We haven't had any missing persons reports matching that description recently," Linda replied. "But let me run it through our last month intake logs. Can you send over a photo?" Dorian glanced at Max. "Give me 20 minutes. He hung up and leaned against the counter, watching Max look up at him expectantly. "You ready to help again?" Secretary Max yipped and stood tail wagging, clearly proud of his promotion. It took a little effort to coax the woman into letting him take her picture. She had bathed and dressed in another one of Sarah's soft sweaters, this one lavender gray, and sat at the window seat overlooking the back garden. Her hair had been gently brushed, and she looked at the snow-covered yard with a distant reverence as if trying to remember why it felt familiar. Dorian crouched beside her phone in hand. "May I take a photo?" he asked gently. "Just for identification, to help find your family." She nodded slowly. "I suppose, if it helps." It did. Within 2 hours, Linda called back. "We might have a match," she said, her tone lifting. "There's a patient who was discharged from our memory ward 3 weeks ago, Mavis Langley. Her daughter signed her out against our recommendation citing a private care arrangement. Last known address was Aurora, Dorian wrote it down, eyes narrowing slightly. And there's no contact. Now, none. But the file has an emergency number for a June Langley. He felt a jolt recalling the name on the scrap of paper Max had uncovered. Can you give it to me? I'm afraid I can't release that directly. But if you'd like, I can reach out and pass along your contact info. Dorian exhaled. Please do. After he ended the call, he stood for a moment in the hallway outside the guest room. The name Mavis felt strange on his tongue, but also solid. Real. A thread pulled free from the tangle of confusion. He looked down. Max stood beside him, head tilted. That's her name, Dorian said. Mavis. Max gave a soft bark as if satisfied. By afternoon, Dorian and Max headed into town. Mavis had fallen asleep again after lunch, vegetable soup, and 2 slices of toast, which she ate slowly but contentedly. She didn't seem frightened anymore, just tired. They stopped first at the Boulder Public Library. It was a classic red brick building tucked near the edge of the park, filled with sunlit reading alcoves and the soft scent of old paper. Dorian wasn't someone who visited libraries often, but he respected places that held quiet and answers. At the information desk stood a young librarian named Aaron, early 30s, wearing wireframe glasses, a mustard cardigan, and a genuine smile that reached his brown eyes. We're trying to trace someone, Dorian said, placing the printed photo of Mavis on the counter. Name might be Mavis Langley, possibly connected to Aurora or Boulder. I was hoping there might be record of her events attended, maybe even family mentioned in local news. Aaron's eyes flicked from the photo to Dorian, then to Max, who was sitting quietly at his heel. Give me a minute, Aaron said, already typing. Max shifted closer to Dorian, his little body warm against the cold tiles. Dorian reached down and gently scratched behind his ears. You've become part of the process now, he murmured. 15 minutes later, Aaron returned with a few clippings printed from the digital archives. Here, he said, placing the pages down. There was a Mavis Langley listed in a 2017 Garden Club article. Won second place for a lavender border in the city showcase. Same last name, pops up in a fundraiser for the Alzheimer's Care Center in Aurora, hosted by a June Langley. Dorian nodded, recognizing the photo from earlier. The woman in the garden. He took the pages, folded them carefully, and looked at Aaron. Thank you. Let me know if you need more, Aaron said. And your dog's very well behaved. He's new, Dorian replied with the hint of a smile, still figuring things out. Seems like he's doing a great job. Outside, as they walked toward the car, Dorian glanced at Max. Well, assistant, what's next? Max barked and wagged his tail. That night, as snow began falling again in fine, misty strands, Dorian returned to the guest room. Mavis was awake, gazing at the fireplace flickering across the room. I remember lavender, she said quietly as he entered. Not much else. But I remember growing it. Rows of it. You did, Dorian confirmed. You even won an award. She smiled faintly. Did I? He showed her the article Aaron had found. Her eyes scanned the print, slowly stopping at the photo. That's me, she said softly. And that's June. Her face grew still. I have a daughter. Yes. We're trying to reach her now. She looked at him, then the confusion clearing for just a moment. You've done so much for me, and I don't even know your name. Dorian, he said. She reached over and laid a hand over his. Thank you, Dorian. Max jumped up beside her again, curling into the crook of her arm. She stroked his fur gently. And you, my little knight. Dorian exhaled slowly. Something was mending. And for the first time since Sarah's passing, he whispered the words aloud, half to Max, half to himself. Your family now? The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains as Dorian stood at the edge of the gravel driveway, the wind curling softly through the pine trees that lined his estate. He had changed into a navy wool sweater and dark jeans, less formal than his usual attire, but still immaculate. His gray eyes scanned the horizon, shifting between the long drive and the mountain peaks beyond. Max, the golden retriever puppy with fluffy light golden fur and wide curious eyes, stood beside him, tail flicking, with unspent energy. The call had come in earlier that morning, a quiet voice on the line. I'm June Langley. I was told, my mother is with you. Dorian remembered the tremble beneath her control, the disbelief braided with hope. He had given her the address, told her to take her time. She hadn't. Within hours, she was on the road from Aurora. The car appeared at last, a silver sedan, coated in a thin layer of slush from the mountain roads. It pulled to a stop with a gentle crunch, and the door opened. June stepped out. She was in her early 30s with sun-kissed olive skin and a slender frame wrapped in a thick green parka. Her dark brown hair was tied in a loose braid, a few strands tugged free by the wind. Her features were sharp but softened by emotion, high cheekbones, deep-set hazel eyes that immediately swept toward the house. There was something of her mother in her jawline, in the way her brow furrowed. Dorian approached slowly, hands in his coat pockets. "Miss Langley." She turned to him. "Yes, you're Mr. Hale." He nodded. "Dorian, she's inside, warm, safe, waiting." She exhaled as if she had been holding her breath since the phone call. Max trotted up to her and barked once, tail wagging in a frantic blur. She knelt instinctively, hands reaching out. "Who's this Max?" Dorian replied. "He's the one who found your mother." She laughed, sudden and tearful, as Max licked her palms, then sat and leaned into her knees like they had always known each other. "Good boy," she whispered. "Thank you." Inside the house, Mavis sat on the chaise lounge in the den, a blanket across her lap, her gaze distant but not vacant. She had been more alert that morning, recalling June's name without prompting. When she heard the front door open, she turned her head. June entered the room in 3 hesitant steps, and then collapsed to her knees. "Mama," she breathed. Mavis blinked, eyes wide. Her lips trembled.